The honourable member for Coolong.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. Well, it's my pleasure to rise to speak on the Fair Work Amendment Bill 2013. But it's not my pleasure to follow the member for Melbourne, a Greens member for Melbourne, because he doesn't disclose his interests in this place, namely that before the last election the Greens received $325,000 from the Electoral Trades Union, the Victorian branch. $125,000 went to the member for Melbourne for his campaign there, and then another $200,000 went to Senator Richard Di Natale.
Order.
Now, if you want to find...
Order. The honourable member resume his seat. The member for, I think, on a point of order.
This is a bill about industrial relations. It's about Fair Work Australia. It's not a bill about electoral disclosure or electoral funding.
Order. 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 The honourable member will address the bill before the chair.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. It is a relevant point, though, to mention the money that has been received by the Greens from the union movement. But I rise to speak on this bill, which is the latest example of the Labor Party pandering to the union movement. Because the Labor Party is not interested in productivity gains, the Labor Party is not interested in increasing employment, it's interested only in paying back its union masters. But that shouldn't be of any surprise to us. That should not be of any surprise to us, because if you go to the Labor caucus, 100% of them are members of the union. But if you go to a Labor federal or state meeting, national conference, the unions automatically have 50% of the votes. Why is that important here? It's because the union movement is only 13% of the private sector workforce of Australia, and only just under 20% if you take into account the public sector. So what we've seen under this government, and this Fair Work Amendment Bill is just another example of this, is the increase in the union power right across the board. We've seen increased union power in right of entry. We've seen increased union power in greenfield sites. We've seen increased union power in the ability to strike first and talk later. We've seen increased union representation on the Fair Work Commission, and this is no surprise when the Minister for Industrial Relations in this country is the former National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union. And don't take my word for it, take the word of Cathy Jackson. And Cathy Jackson, the former head of the HSU, said that the member for Maribyrnong is Dracula in charge of the blood bank. That's what she said about the Minister for Industrial Relations. Now, we have seen many scandals involving unions. We've seen the member for Dobell. We've seen the abolition of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, a very positive decision, an announcement, an institution set up by the previous Howard government that came out of the Coal Royal Commission. It was designed to stop lawlessness in the building sector. Across this country, particularly in Victoria and Western Australia, it was doing a very important job of providing a cop on the beat. But the Labor Party, together with the unions, came into this place and together with the Greens and abolished the ABCC. And that is a very bad outcome for the Australian workplaces and for the Australian people. Now, what this Fair Work Amendment Bill does is it breaks another solemn promise of the Prime Minister of the Australian people. We've seen her broken promises on private health insurance. We've seen her broken promises on the family tax benefit. We've seen the broken promises on the carbon tax, and now we've seen the broken promises on the Fair Work Act. Because the Prime Minister has claimed, and this is her quote, that she has consulted for hour after hour with business leaders, with union leaders, with small business leaders to get the balance right. And we have built a modern and fair system that has got the balance right. Well, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, they haven't got the balance right. And again, you don't need to take the Coalition's word for it. You have to look at what someone like Innes Willox, who's the head of the Australian Industry Group, said in an interview on the ABC. He said there are in this Fair Work Act, about 160 different measures under the Fair Work Act, Mark 1 and 2, which are very clearly pro-union. And we can't find not one that is pro-employer under the Act. Now that's a pretty amazing statement from the head of the Australian Industry Group. That's not a coalition MP speaking, that's the head of a major organisation in this country. And my concern, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, about the bill before this House is that it hasn't followed proper process. There hasn't been a regulatory impact statement. In fact, when members of the department responsible came before the Senate committee, they couldn't actually explain why there had been an exemption of this bill from getting a proper regulatory impact statement. The other thing that concerns me about this bill is it doesn't include the recommendations that came forward from the government's own Fair Work Review panel. The government handpicked a number of people to provide a review which was supposed to lead to some significant changes to the Fair Work Act to make it more balanced and more productivity focused. And what did they do? They haven't taken up the recommendations. And one such recommendation was that saying union bosses in the workplace should be treated as any other employee. And that was coming out of the Bendigo-TAFE case. And there was something very interesting that also came out of that Bendigo-TAFE case. And that is that a Justice of the High Court, Justice Hayden, had said in that decision of the High Court that the government's intervention by the minister responsible, the Labor government's intervention, he said, I quote, "The minister's stance before and during the oral hearing has not been that of an intervener, but that of a partisan." And Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, that's what we have from this government. We don't have from this government an independent, even hand in industrial relations. We have from this government interventions based on what are in the union's interest. And then in this bill, again, we're seeing many examples of it. For example, in this bill, the right of entry provisions that are provided are much more punitive and will not enhance productivity and jobs growth in our country and in our workplaces. One of the amendments that the government would obviously like to promote is that where the employer and the employee cannot agree on a meeting place, the default meeting place is in the lunchroom. In the lunchroom. Now, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, there are many people who are going to be sitting in their lunchroom wanting to have their burger and their Coke and their fries in peace and quiet. In peace and quiet, but they're going to have union representatives come into that place, interrupt their lunch and try to sign them up. It's as if what you have done it's what you've done in terms of the childcare workforces and what you've done in terms of the aged care workforces, where you tried to boost the flagging membership of the union movement by making some payments to those sectors contingent upon increasing your membership. You're doing it again. You're doing it again. And it's outrageous. It's an abuse of power and it's abuse of process. What about the fact that 87% of the private sector workforce in this country have decided not to join a union, but they can't eat their burger and chips in quiet? How do you say about that? In fact, this was not even a recommendation of the government's hand-picked Fair Work Review panel. This is all about union membership, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. And what about the other one? What about the other recommendation that this government's seeking to implement it through this legislation? To make employers liable for the transport costs when they want to go and use their right of entry in a remote location. You are asking the employer to pay for the union rep to go out and try to recruit employees to join a union. How outrageous is that? And don't take my word for it, take the employer's word for it. Because they have said, for example, the Australian Metals and Mining Association, that this could lead to an increase of some $30,000 in costs on some occasions, just because you want to recruit more members. Now, those costs will go straight off the bottom line, come straight off the bottom line of a company, and who are they passed on to? Who are they passed on to? They're passed on to the consumer. They're passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. So you are actually, by deciding to go and recruit members for your flagging unions, you have decided to pass on higher costs to the Australian consumers. And I think this is absolutely outrageous, particularly when you consider that the Prime Minister has promised that she wouldn't have changed the right of entry provisions. How about this quote from the National Press Club debate in November of 2007? The Prime Minister of today. I'm happy to do whatever you would like. If you would like me to pledge to resign, to sign a contract in blood, to take a polygraph, to bet my house on it, to give you my mother as a hostage, whatever you would like. That's what she said when she promised not to change the right of entry provisions. And now we've seen those right of entry provisions, and it's opened the floodgates to the unions to interrupt the workplaces of hard-working Australians and their employers. The AWU made 156 site visits to BHP's Worsley aluminium site just in 2012. In terms of the Pluto site, it saw more than 200 visits from the union in just the first 90 days of the Fair Work Act. Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, that's the evidence. That's the evidence that there's been this graphic abuse of process by those opposite and their mates in the union. What about in this legislation, your decision to want to legislate to create more flexible working arrangements? Well, that's already occurring, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. We heard from the Fair Work Ombudsman, we heard from the department that that's already happening, but you want to legislate that off? If you really want to legislate to increase flexibility in the workplace, why don't you extend the termination date for the individual flexibility agreements from 28 days to 90 days? That was recommended by your own hand-picked review. Why don't you do something about that? The other change that you're wanting to put forward in this bill is you want employers to consult with employees around roster changes. Well, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, that is already standard practice. For those on the opposite side who don't understand modern-day awards, that's already in there. That's already in there. I mean, what you're on about here is opening the floodgates. Is opening the floodgates and making it impractical for employers to actually run a business, to employ people, to boost productivity, and to replicate the successes of the Howard government. What about bullying? Well, when it comes to bullying, we take that very seriously. We take that extremely seriously. But we do not accept what you are providing for in this bill, because there's nothing in this bill that says that if a union official is a bully, then he should pay a price for that. So we want to see an amendment that holds union officials to the same level of account. And we also want employees to first seek help and advice from the independent regulatory agencies such as Safe Work Australia or the Fair Work Ombudsman. And if they confirm that behaviour there may constitute bullying and that alternative remedies have also been considered, then that must be done prior to the lodging with the Fair Work Commission. And I've got news for those on the other side. Their hand-picked chair of the Fair Work Review actually supported our policy here. They supported our policy. So, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, can I just say to the House that when we were in government, we had a suite of industrial relations policies which improved the Australian economy. We delivered 22% increase in real wages. We restored the AAA credit rating for this country. We paid back $96 billion of debt. On the waterfront, we doubled the speed and rate of the cranes being moved. We did all those things and we paid back all your debt that you are now burdening future generations. But with your policies, with your pandering to the union movement, with your abolition of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, with your re-regulation of the workplace, you are taking us backwards, back before Paul Keating's reforms. No wonder you are being hounded out of office. No wonder every business leader from here to Timbuktu is actually criticising you for putting unions first and employers last, and by doing that you're actually actually defeating the best interests of the employees. And you are hurting productivity in this country.
Order. The member for Kooyong's time has expired.